So to get started, you're gonna grab your stock miter gauge for your table saw, and we're gonna attach just a random scrap piece of wood to it. You could absolutely use a fancy aftermarket miter gauge, but I wanted to show you that you don't need one here. Every basic miter gauge that I've seen has spots where you can easily attach a board to it, but just make sure the board is super tight and secure. The stock blade is pretty thin, and it'll make fingers that are pretty small. Hold up just a minute. I actually want to expand on this whole part about the size of the different fingers.
Okay now, dig in.
So the actual size of the individual fingers is 100% determined on the thickness of the blade that you use to cut them with. If you go with a really thick dado stack, you'll end up with fingers that look like this. On the opposite end of the spectrum, if you go with a really thin blade, you'll end up with fingers that look like this. There's really no right or wrong way to determine how you want the fingers to look on your specific piece, but just know that the smaller fingers you have, typically it's going to be a little bit more challenging to fit those pieces together, and it's probably going to take a lot longer to cut because you just have more cuts. On this one, there's probably about 20 cuts as opposed to this one that's 4. So you make the choice. All right, then back to the video. So I'm actually going to remove this thin curved blade and replace it with something a little more substantial. So I grab my dado stack. This is just a stack of blades that allows you to quickly and easily make a cut that's super thick.
Damn boy, he's thick!
With that bad boy locked down, I tossed on my dado throat plate and made a cut that's about 3/4 of an inch tall through my board attached to my miter gauge. The exact height really doesn't matter, just make sure that it's less than the thickness of material that you want to join together with those finger joints. And yes, it's a super slow process with a 1 3/4 horsepower saw. Ah, not again. Just realized I completely forgot to do the whole intro video, so just roll that. The next thing that I need to do is cut a little piece that fits perfectly inside that notch, but unfortunately I have to swap back to my standard table saw blade. You want this piece to fit perfectly, so sneak up on the cut here. The first pass was way too large. The second pass was pretty close. And that third pass was right on the money.
Gets it back in. He's got the ice. Willie, it's in. Yes.
All that excitement aside, now I have to sit and watch the glue dry. There are a lot of ups and downs when it comes to woodworking, so you just have to keep your emotions in check. Once the glue set up, I came back with half of my broken flush trim saw and left about 2 inches sticking out. And this little broken flush trim saw is pretty sad, but if you're somebody out there who would like to help me get to the point where I can actually quit my day job and take this channel full time, as well as get some proper tools, consider checking out all the rewards that I have for you over on Patreon. So if you're interested in picking up one of these exclusive t-shirts like some of these folks up here, consider checking out my Patreon page, but as always, there is no pressure, so let's get back to the build. With that piece trimmed off, I can reinsert my dado stack into the table saw, and you'll notice that that piece will be cut by the blades. So what I need to do is remove the board from my miter gauge and reattach it to the miter gauge using the cutoff from before to perfectly space it over. Now this is the step that's going to determine how tight or how loose those joints go together. After reattaching the board to my miter gauge, you can see that I have got the perfect spacing. To make sure that I don't mess anything up when I'm cutting these joints, I labeled the mating pieces with the same letter. Before I start hogging out the material, you'll notice that my board has a lot of tear out on it.
Cut my life into pieces.
So to prevent that, I used a sacrificial piece of wood behind my panel to make the first cut. After each cut, I removed the clamp, slid the sacrificial piece over, and positioned the previous notch in the correct spot. This entire process is very tedious and it's easy to lose focus, but with all those blades spinning, you really have to be safe. And yes, ideally I would have made that scrap piece that's attached to the miter gauge a little bit longer. And in fact, I actually did on a version like 2. It's basically the exact same principle, just a little bit more space on this side. With all of the notches cut out on the first panel, I went back to the workbench and marked out where I needed to make the mating notches. Oh my gosh, it's hot. All right, so anyway, this is kind of the tricky part, but hopefully I can explain it to you in a way that makes it simple to follow. So this is the first panel here, and I just finished cutting all like the little fingers out. And you would think that this is side A and this is side A. So the next thing you should do is basically just line this panel up and continue to go. But you'll notice that when I do that, it's not actually in the right spot. So what you need to do to make sure that it all works together and everything fits perfectly is you first need to flip this piece 180 degrees, put that back in, and you need to flip this piece. Now, those fingers will be lined up perfectly and you can just go through the rest of the build. Honestly, remembering to rotate the mating pieces is probably the most difficult part of this whole process. That's why I prefer to mark out the joinery before I cut anything, just to double check that I didn't accidentally ruin a panel. Once the first notch is cut on the mating piece, I'll remove that first piece and continue down the line until I have all of the fingers cut. With all of them cut, you can see that they line up perfectly after a few hammer taps, but I could have lowered my blade just a touch so they don't stick out quite as much. And speaking of that, if you were to set your blade too low, this is what it would look like. So you can see here that because the blade wasn't quite high enough, these fingers aren't able to meet all the way in. So to remedy that, you need to actually raise your blade so it's cutting to right about here. That way these fingers can fully seat into one another. And if, for example, you had your blade set too high, this is what it would turn out to be. As you can see, those fingers are joined too far into one another, so they stick out a lot. Now this isn't necessarily a huge issue because you can just go and cut all these individual pieces off. It's gonna be a little bit more time consuming. For the most part, you want your pieces to fit fairly snugly, but still go together easily, like this. So if you run into the situation where you cut everything and no matter what you do, you cannot get those pieces to join together, you need to make a small modification to the jig. So if you run into the situation where your fingers are too tight, that's because this spot here is too close to the blade. So what you need to do is move it over. And obviously I'm exaggerating, but I just want to give you the idea. And on the opposite, if your joints are too loose, that means you need to bring this closer to your blade to tighten everything up. And although I didn't explicitly show making this one here, it's really no different from what I showed you before. I just wanted to show you that if you want these big fingers, you're gonna want a bigger block here as well as the bigger hole there. But if you want the smaller fingers, it's the exact same thing, except your pieces are smaller. So there's that smaller slit there and that smaller block sticking out here. Again, it's the exact same process, just different size. So really, as long as your table saw can accommodate the blade size, there's really no limit to what you can do for the size of the different fingers. Anyway, I hope that information helped you out. And make sure to hit that subscribe button right here if you want to check out a full project built with box joints, because my next video is going to be a project with box joints. Again, huge shout out to my Patreon community who are making unsponsored videos like this possible. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.